Well, welcome everyone to the inaugural, hopefully not the last one, senior researcher session of the Informs MIF summer webinar series. These sessions aim to highlight the work of senior researchers and hopefully foster and help connections between senior and early career researchers. Today, we are super lucky, so fortunate to have Professor Mark Lewis and Charles Worrell presenting their research today. We're gonna begin our session hearing from Dr. Lewis, now the Director of Operations Research and Information Engineering at Cornell University, through his presentation titled A Stochastic Model for When to Invoke Telemedicine Visits in a MIF Clinic. So with that, Mark, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Just one correction. I'm now, as of June 30th, no longer the director of the School of ORIE. I'm actually on sabbatical out here at Amazon, but so it's 8 in the morning for me. But that's perfectly fine. It's no worries at all.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Let me just start sharing my screen and jump right into it. There is a slide or two to introduce myself as, oops, that's the wrong date, for who I am. This is the title of the talk. This is joint work with my student, Xuan Liu, and my colleague, Jamal Pender, who some of you may know, also a member of the Minority Issues Forum. I'm at Cornell, and there's my affiliation. So before I get into any details about the talk, I think I'd like to introduce myself, because some of you may not know me. So broadly speaking, I study dynamic decision-making under uncertainty. You know, don't worry, I have 40 slides, but I doubt I'll go through all 40 of them. It's meant for a longer talk, which is why it's on the date. Mainly my applications of the dynamic decision making is in queuing theory, and turns out that when I started doing this thing, I was thinking about data setting in a line. A queue is basically a line. So data setting in a line. So I started thinking about telecommunications, and then I moved into call centers and service centers for healthcare and people setting in lines as well. And it turns out that lots of other things can stand in lines. I should just tell you that is manufacturing, in the manufacturing system, parts stand in a line in a job shop. I mentioned healthcare, even in some silly things like a banking situation, or in a to go to get gas at the gas station, you're standing in a line waiting for the person in front of you to finish up. All those things are standing in a line. And what makes me an engineer is that I'm interested in optimizing those lines. How do we do something dynamically to make those lines work better? So in addition, because the area of dynamic decision making is pretty broad, I've done other application areas. So for example, inventory control, I've written papers there. Wireless communications, well, I guess that fits more like in the electrical engineering space, but I've done some work in that area. Meal provisioning. Turns out that some airlines give every person on the plane a meal, and they deteriorate. So you can't leave them out for a long time. And so they have to make sure that the number of meals they provide matches the number of people that are actually on the plane. So these are the kinds of things I've been working on. And right now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm at Amazon and I'm working on pricing and logistics. So there are a broader range of dynamic decision-making things, always with the stochastic element, so like the uncertainty piece. And then I have a sort of a side interest of mine, which is in the Markov decision process theory. So I've worked on things like discounted cost and how they converge to average cost, et cetera. So let me get started to what I'm going to talk about today. It turns out that pharmacies started to provide basic medical care within the pharmacy. And many of you may know this already because you may have gotten your COVID shot at Walgreens or at CVS or wherever. But they're able to do other things too in larger areas. And so they have these larger things that they call minute clinics in some of the pharmacies. And the nice thing is, maybe it goes to the next. Yeah. The nice thing is that you can reach areas that maybe wouldn't have access to healthcare otherwise, because places like CVS and Walgreens already have brick and mortar stores all over the country. And so now, instead of having to have another doctor's office separately from that CVS or Walgreens, they can house some medical service providers right there in those pharmacies. And so the thing is that you don't want to have a doctor in every pharmacy. That would be the same as having a doctor's office in every pharmacy, which is just too expensive to do. What you can do is you can have licensed vocational nurses or nurse practitioners that may be sitting actually in the pharmacy at certain times of the day And then the question becomes, how often should they access a doctor via a telemedicine connection? So from my perspective, the nice thing about this being the type of person I am, I just feel like we should be expanding things and giving access to healthcare places maybe people wouldn't have had healthcare before, or maybe they just couldn't go to a doctor for whatever reason. They can go right to their local CVS or Walgreens or whatever, where the mini clinics are. Okay, so it turns out not all patients need a higher level of care. So not all patients need to see a doctor. So one can see a nurse practitioner instead. But sometimes they do. And so the NPs and the nurse practitioners might then decide they then have to call a doctor via telemedicine. And then there's a somewhat in between situation where the NPs can decide whether they need to call for telemedicine or not. And when we talk to the NPs, they say, well, it sort of depends on how much experience you have. So sometimes the more senior NPs would say, I call, only seldomly, and some of the more junior NPs maybe they're calling quite a bit more frequently. And so the idea is that you enter this mini clinic, you might see an NP, you might get a good quick sense of whether you need to call for a telemedicine visit, and if not, then they have a decision to make. Okay, so we do think about the question of staffing. It turns out, let's see if I have it on the next slide. Yeah, it turns out that if you were to think about these, each one, I guess you can't see my finger pointing at the screen here. Can you see my mouse pointing at the screen? Yeah, okay. Think about each one of these things saying living in different cities. These are each one a different CVS or Walgreens. Okay, so each one is a different pharmacy. And it could be that a doctor may be able to provide service for all but 5 of these, but sitting in another city, in another place. And part of their day would be to sit and wait for be on call, so to speak, for one of these CVS equipped with NPs to call and reach a doctor. It's interesting in the sense that this is not the paper I'm going to talk about today. What's interesting about this is that it turns out that because we have states with state lines, it could be that you could be sitting in one state geographically closer as a doctor, sitting in one state geographically closer to the pharmacy where someone's trying to call you, and you cannot provide telemedicine visit because you're in a different state. And some states allow you to cross those lines, some states don't. So my example, living in upstate New York, is it's possible, although I'm not sure about the New Jersey or Philadelphia or Pennsylvania laws, it's possible that I'm sitting in New Jersey right next to Philadelphia, and I cannot provide service for someone in Philadelphia, and yet someone who's sitting in Philadelphia may be able to provide service for someone in Pittsburgh. The distances are pretty clear that the distance between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh is much further than, say, Philadelphia to right over the bridge to be New Jersey. So we did provide some of this information to the client at the time and allowed them to do some what-if scenarios via an Excel spreadsheet. I could talk a little bit more about that later on if you'd like, but that's not really what I wanted to talk about over the next, I don't know, 15 or so minutes. Here's what I do want to talk about. This is the model inside a single mini clinic. So when you come to a mini clinic, what would happen is there's an intake process. That's what we call triage. They check you out, and they check your blood pressure, your vitals, etc. And then after you've had, well, there's 2 parts of that actually. There's one part that's not really depicted here, where they take your blood pressure, etc., and then they have a nurse practitioner actually do a little bit more of an exam on you. So I'm ignoring that very first part, the intake piece. But say you arrive to this mini clinic, you do the things I mentioned to you that's not depicted, and then you see a nurse practitioner. And the patient then would be reviewed by this nurse practitioner to decide whether or not the person needs to seek telemedicine. So here I'm depicting this as with probability P, person needs to seek telemedicine. There's no choice, you have to. And with probability 1 minus P, it's sort of in that gray area that I mentioned to you earlier. And the nurse practitioner gets to decide, do I seek telemedicine, that's the bottom part, or do I go and do this without collaboration and do it on my own? And so what's depicted here is, think about this is a queuing system now. You can see patients arriving, they may queue before this triage station, and then a decision is made, that's the optimization piece, and then you have to decide where to put patients for each one. And the goal then is going to be to minimize the overall average, what we are calling cost, or the overall total cost of this system. Okay, so I'm assuming I'll make some assumptions here to make this all work for me. So the assumption is going to be in a minute, I'm gonna get rid of this arrival piece. I'm not gonna worry about that. I'm gonna assume that all these mu naught, mu1, and mu2 are rates of an exponential random variable. So they serve at rate mu1 or mu naught, mu1 or mu2, depending on where you're being served. And that all patients are going to be in the case of this decision-making point here. I'm just going to ignore this piece here. This piece is already a part of the system. Okay, so that's what's basically depicted. That's what's basically shown here. In the next part of the slide, no need to read it. I just explained it to you all in words, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Just know that the rates are the rate of triage, the rate of collaboration, and the rate of non-collaboration. One more thing I should mention. If you look here, you'll see there's a queue in front of triage, so some patients may be sitting there, and there's a queue in front of collaboration waiting for a doctor. But if you're a nurse practitioner, you're seeing the patient at triage, and then you're following them through to the end. You don't leave them. So if you do non-collaboration, you are no longer allowed to do triage at the same time. You're going to go off to do non-collaboration. Similarly, if you're doing collaboration, you must wait in the queue for a doctor to be available with the patient. You're not leaving them. And then maybe they do the collaborative interaction with via telemedicine. So the MPs, as we call them here, are moving along the system at each step. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to assume that there's some number of nurse practitioners, some number of general practitioners. Think of the number of general practitioners as being much less, than the number of nurse practitioners. That's because they're just cheaper and they're not physically in the minute clinic. I told you, as I mentioned to you earlier, MPs are going to follow along with the patient from triage to collaboration and non-collaboration. Here's some related work. I'm going to get to the optimization piece in just a second. Here's some related work. There's some work that if you do anything with queuing, the first two papers listed here include Mike Harrison and Ruth Williams. If you do anything in queuing, you probably are going to run across those two people anyway. They've been I want to say mother and father, they're not married, so the forefathers or four parents of the field for the last 30 years, or maybe even longer. And then Hun Soo Ahn at Wesley's alma mater in East Duenas and things. And so Rachel was there at Michigan at the time too. And then I've done some work with my colleague Doug Down in that work. These are the papers that I'm going to mention that are sort of related to this work that we've done. There are 3 papers that my student is writing. The third one is just about done. The second one is going to appear in the simulation conference, I think in December. And the first one is already under review, and we need to find out what's going on with that, because it's been a minute for us to hear back from the reviewers. So think of this. So it's interesting because when you go to a minute clinic, you can go during a regular time period, and the decision is much easier. So the nurse practitioners may be willing to call for a telemedicine visit when there's nobody there, basically. There's no concern about having to miss other patients that may need them as well. So what we're looking at instead is a time of a demand spike. So you can think of that as just being a certain number of people above the nominal level. And the goal then is to get back to the nominal working level that you normally would see given the staffing of the minute clinic. So think of it as a bunch of people there, and we're trying to get back down to what we're calling the zero state, which is basically the nominal level of the way the thing operates normally. Okay, so I've gotten rid of the arrivals. This is the same picture I had before, except now I don't have arrivals. I'm calling the empty system the zero state, and what we're trying to do is everybody that's there at that time gets to get moved out of the system, get to zero. And the goal is, how do I do that in the most efficient way possible? And in manufacturing, this happens a lot. I just visited a couple of months ago a manufacturing plant in Indiana for Toyota, and this is exactly how they do it. Everyone has a certain amount of work they have to do that day. The goal is to get that work all done back down to zero, and then they're able to leave at that time when all their work is done. Okay, so here's the MVP model. I don't know what time I started, Leslie. Can you give me a hint? How much time do I have to complete my talk? Is it 3 minutes or 8 minutes I have left? I don't know.
About 8 minutes. Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, good. There's 3 minutes. I'm only on slide 13, so we have to move a little faster. Okay, so this is mainly, if you're a stochastic modeler, you know the thing called the state space. Basically, what that tells you is this is all the possible states a system can be in. It covers everything. The state space. I is going to be the number of patients in triage. J is the number of patients in service in triage. K is the number of patients currently receiving non-collaborative care, and L is the number of patients at the collaborative station, including those in service. And so the action set is 0, 1, as it was depicted in the previous one. After you make a triage action, you get to choose what direction the person is going to go. We're assuming that all the policies are non-aligned and non-preemptive. I think I'm going to, I'll quickly go over this. So because the important bits here are the ones that are in red. I'm talking about the number of patients. So this would be the I, this would be the J. I think this is the K, and this is the L. Okay. And then now we have costs. So I'm charging myself H0 per patient per unit time waiting in the triage phase, including those in service. H1 is going to be the number of the cost per patient per unit time in the non-collaborative phase, and H2 is the cost per patient per time in the collaborative phase. Think of this as holding costs, if you will, in manufacturing. It's the same idea, but you can also think of it as the cost to the system of having people to wait, and they're weighted depending on where you are in the system. Okay. Okay, so the goal then is to minimize the total cost over that time. I already told you this before, and it's assuming that I'm always going to work all the time. This thing is finding almost surely, so I'm going to minimize the total expected cost of the system. You don't need to read this slide. If you trust that I can do the math, that's all that is. Okay, so I'm assuming that P is equal to 0. That's the one that I mentioned to you before, and that when I empty the system, there's no more cost. Okay, this slide, and then I'll fast forward a little bit. So this slide just tries to give you a sense of how the decision should be made. And the idea is that if I think of myself as deciding between going to triage and going to collaboration, I can look ahead and see how much it would cost me to get a particular patient out of the system if I were to go to triage, and the time it takes to do that, versus the cost it takes to go to do exactly the same thing, that particular patient out of the system, if I do collaborative care, and the time it takes to do that. Why is that important? The cost is easy. The cost is simple. You can see that if I'm trying to decide the best action to take, I should probably try and minimize the cost. But if I do that minimizing the cost ahead and ignore the time it takes to do that, I'm no longer able to serve at the triage stage. So I'm costing myself something in the background. And so I have to take into account both the cost and the time it takes, because there's a cost to having me at the NP move along in collaboration or non-collaboration because of the time it takes to do so. That's all this says. That's all this says in the slide. If I do non-collaboration, the cost is H1 over mu1. That's the expected cost. So I get to do it immediately, or I have to wait for everyone in front of me to get out, plus my own time to get out, and that's at the cost as you see there in red in the bottom right corner. The time is almost exactly the same. If I go to non-collaborative, it's 1 over mu1. That's the expected cost of an exponential. If I do the collaborative case, I have to wait for everyone else to leave, and the expected cost should be no H2 here, but it's just this part here. Okay, so this is the theorem we have. The theorem says that if it turns out that the cost is the cost, if I have to wait, this is what this says, L bigger than CG. If I have to wait for collaboration, and the cost is lower to do non-collaboration, and the time is lower to do non-collaboration, then you don't use collaborative care at all. Just that sense. If I don't have to wait, and the cost is lower to do non-collaboration, and the time is lower, same thing. So it's sort of an intuitive theorem but it does guide us in the next phase of what we're going to talk about, and I better hurry along through this. But you can ask me questions at the end if you want. The idea is that you can prove this using basically a sample path argument to get this done. The opposite direction doesn't hold, by the way, because there's other considerations that I'm not going to have time to go over. There's extra costs hidden that I can talk about later if you like. So let me then skip ahead and tell you what else we can show, and then I'll go to I'm sorry, I'm gonna just there. Yes. Okay. So intuitively, what I skipped over those 8 slides, intuitively, one would think that the policy at whether you go to collaboration or non-collaboration should be influenced heavily by what's happening at the triage phase. If I have 1 million people at the triage phase, I want to get back there as fast as I possibly can. If I have 1 person in the triage phase, I'm not in such a hurry to get back there. Okay. And so what we are able to show is that as that queue at the triage phase grows, that encourages me to get back there as fast as I can. And the time is the dominating factor to get back there. So we develop a heuristic based on that idea and the idea of taking into account that cost I mentioned to you earlier. So here's a set of parameters we ran a numerical study on. We compare this to base policy of threshold policies and different baseline policies. Always collaborate. Use threshold of 10, use threshold of 15. Never collaborate. Baseline 2 is always collaborate. Baseline 1 is not never collaborate. And then 1 is collaborate if you have a CG available, if you can go right there immediately. And you can see here that some of these policies don't do so great compared to the optimal policy. Okay. And in the last minute, I'm going to give you the punchline of my whole talk, which is, and you can see, by the way, it says max. So the only thing that's changing here is the mu1 is bigger than mu2, and mu2 is bigger than mu1. And you can see how bad some of these policies can be compared to optimal. Okay. So this is the basic, this table here tells you the heuristic I'm using, which basically is find a threshold policy that works for you in both whether you have to wait for collaboration or whether you wait for collaboration or don't have to wait for collaboration. Find a threshold policy that works for you. This is proved. We can prove that for large I, this is the correct way to think about things. And then we do this. Oh, I'm going to skip that. If we do this, then we can reduce the error in a significant way. So the previous thought that I had to skip over because I don't have time to cover is how to do this. But there are ways to get the threshold policies correct. And you saw we went down from max error being in the hundreds of percentages down to around 1 or less than 2% in the case. And that's true for mu1 bigger than mu2. And you can see a similar thing for mu2 bigger than mu1. Okay, so that's sort of we're drinking from a water hose view of this whole thing. But at the very beginning, hopefully you got a sense of what we're trying to do. At the end, what I hope you took away from this is that we can develop heuristics to do a very good job at scheduling this nurse practitioners if they follow our recommendations. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. I do have questions, but I would like to invite the attendees. If you have any questions, you can either type it on the Q&A or make sure that there are no open questions here, and or you can raise your hand, and I'm happy to unmute you. All right, I will get us started then. Can you go back on the intuition of these like threshold policies? Like it seems that that's where the magic is.
Yeah.
Like what's the secret sauce when they're developing these type of thresholds that are easy to understand but still work well?
Yeah. Let me just show you the picture again because that's the way that's exactly what you. Let me just share again and show you the picture. That's where you're exactly right. That's where the intuition in the meat of the whole study is. So the thing here is that, first of all, you're sitting here trying to make a decision. And if you look ahead, that's going to tell you that that's just going to be the cost and the time, right? If I look ahead, I'm saying, oh, if I can tell you if this cost is lower and the time is lower, I should be able to just use this one. Just use non-collaboration.
Mhm.
And that's what the theorem says. That's what the next theorem says. On the other hand, if the cost is lower here and the time is lower, is a little bit something else is happening here because there's also this queuing effect. And so you have to queue, and where you're basically doing nothing. Here you're working all the time. Here you're sitting there waiting, and that cost is felt by those back here. And so as that number gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you really, really want to get back over there to help those people that are in the queue. And what we can't prove is that a threshold policy is optimal all the time. There's a counterexample. What we can prove is if that line is really, really long, we should really be pushing ourselves back to station 0, this triage station. And then from there, we can use lots of different techniques, so fluid model techniques, all kinds of ways, come up with a threshold policy that does work well. And that's what the last part of the talk is about. So I'm sorry I went through that way too fast, but that's the idea. Good question.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, it's quite intuitive. Excellent.
Mhm.
All right, so let's shift gears now. Thank you again, Mark. Oh,
Absolutely.
Charles, please go ahead.
Thank you,
There
muted.
you go. Yeah. So, Professor Lewis, glad to
Wow.
meet you. I think I missed your articulation of your how you were calculating cost. But as I heard what we were talking about, it sounded like we were optimizing time and short lines, but I didn't recognize an introduction of the quality of the care and the effectiveness of the care in your optimization. Did I miss that?
No, you didn't miss it. So let me see. So the quality of the care, and let me just give you a sense of what's going on here. This is all supposedly, the quality is maybe, well, let me say it like this. The quality of the care is hidden in the holding cost. So if someone spending time at the collaborative phase is getting, let's say, better care than one who's sitting in the non-collaborative phase, then you would see a holding cost that is higher for that person than at the non-collaborative phase. It's all sort of captured in those costs, and we don't make any assumptions about what the ordering is. Like, is the quality of care better with non-collaborative care or collaborative care? We don't make an assumption about that. We sort of spend the whole gamut on that one. That's the answer to your question. Yes, but I didn't really go through the details of it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Good to meet you as well.
Excellent. All right, so let's shift gears now into the talk by Dr. Charles Worrell, who's going to be telling us what kind of stuff is happening at the MITRE Corporation. With that, Charles, please go ahead.
Well, glad to talk to you all. I'm sitting here trying to figure out how to lower my raised hand because I think it's still up.
I think Wesley can do that.
Okay, thank you. So we wanted to talk today about the distinction or the contrast between doing research in academia and doing research in industry. So I wanted to share a couple of words to provide some context about the particular company I work for and why it is and how it is that we find ourselves doing research in the first place, and then give you 3 quick examples of some R&D projects that I've worked on in the past, and then give us some basis for maybe having some conversation about that distinction, if that's okay. So let me start by mentioning my personal path to doing R&D is a little unconventional. I started my career as an officer in the Navy, and then did some network operations at Verizon, and some technology insertion for the American Automobile Association. Then I spent the last many years at MITRE supporting different government clients and doing some R&D along the way. I actually pursued and got my doctorate later, mid-career, as opposed to in the beginning. And just as an attempt to give a metric of, well, how much R&D have I actually had the chance to do, either through myself or teams that I was managing, published about 32 journal articles, have a single patent, and are presented at a number of different forums, including some Informs forums. I think a lot of Informs. So the MITRE Corporation was established in 1958, interestingly, in response to just some big changes the government was facing at the time. There was a then famous aviation incident. The commercial aviation industry was new, and something happened no one anticipated. Two airplanes flying over the desert just happened to collide and run into each other. And the government recognized, ooh, maybe we need some sort of airspace management system. And right around the same time, there was a new threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and there was no integrated method or system for monitoring those and responding to those. So to support those two mission areas, the MITRE was spun off from the MIT Lincoln Labs to provide a commercial entity that could work in this space. A term that may not be used in every household is a federally funded research and development center. And these are special organizations that promote collaboration to solve large-scale problems for the federal government. FFRDCs serve as long-term strategic partners to government and are charged with providing objective guidance and creating an environment that's free of conflicts of interest. Much of that work goes unseen, occasionally gets publicized. The MITRE Corporation is a private nonprofit company who is solely in the business of operating FFRDCs for the United States government. We operate 6 such centers. The names are a little cryptic, so I'll just briefly say one supports the FAA and Department of Transportation, modernizing the transportation system. One supports the U.S. Treasury and many other financial regulators. One supports the Department of Health and Human Services. One supports the Department of Homeland Security. We have a cybersecurity center that supports NIST in developing national standards for cybersecurity. And our largest and oldest center is the National Security Engineering Center. We support virtually all agencies of the Defense Department and the intelligence community. As an attribute of the special objectives of an FFRDC, all 6 of the sponsoring agreements that our centers have with government call for us to perform independent research and development as a means to help solve important government problems and strengthen the skills of our technical staff. So we are obligated to spend about 6% of our revenue on research that addresses the needs of federal government sponsors. And our annual revenues are at about $2 billion. So we'll spend $120 million on research this year. About 80 million of that goes to projects that are proposed by the technical staff and then selected through various competitions that we hold. Some of our research involves forward-looking future needs of the federal government, and some gets directed toward more immediate current priorities. Because our mission is to solve important national problems, we try to use address known problems with emerging technologies. And we look to those known problems to inspire the research, and the sweet spot for where we are charged to work is what Daniel Stokes called Pasteur's quadrant, where new technology is a match for a known problem. Our objective in our research is always to transition those products for use by federal agencies. And because of our trusted relationships as FFRDCs, we sometimes get access to non-public data in support of our investigations. We frequently collaborate with universities to bring unique capabilities into our work. And in addition to publishing as an outlet, our research typically gets briefed to government leaders who have related needs, again, to facilitate that transition. Sometimes we pilot concepts with interested state and local governments as a proof of concept to federal agencies. So the first of the three projects that I'm going to talk about is one that the title was Human Behavior Modeling. The objective was to model the impact of public immigration on immigration behavior. The government has a lot of ways to promulgate information about what our policies are, or what behaviors we would like people of the public to comply with. And this was an effort to apply some rigor to that planning and to find new ways to use information to impact what's going on the ground. I will just briefly characterize this particular method. Applied multi method models. We started with for each problem space that we addressed, identifying, well, what are the key drivers of an individual's decision to migrate in the first place, and by using those individual perspectives, aggregate into a collective behavior of a population. At the time this work was done, the primary inflow of immigrants to this country was from Mexico, and there are some very specific regions in Mexico that were at the time providing the largest numbers of immigrants, and it was a very well studied population. So we isolated down to 7 questions. Will I live in poverty if I stay in Mexico? Do I expect to avoid apprehension making my border crossing? Do I expect to die making the border crossing? It's not well known. There are estimates that about 5% of the people that try end in death. What does my family think about my decision? Do I expect to find employment when I get to the U.S.? Do I expect to live in poverty in the U.S. once I get there? And the last question we considered is, can I avoid apprehension while living in the U.S.? So these 7 questions were selected through a particular method and then represented empirically with some models that we got from, well, we had a team of psychologists supporting us. We used a Bayesian inference network to aggregate the impact of those 7 questions into that final conclusion. And we were able to select the parameters for the BayesNet based on empirical measurable things. So if we just look empirically at the population of Mexico, we can calculate 93% of Mexicans make the choice to stay home, and less than 1% make the choice to make a legal entry into the United States. So that gets to 6% of the population that is actually engaging in our behavior of interest. And then again, for all those other 7 things, we had sources that told us what the ground truth is. We recognized, especially in this population, in any population, there's a social network impact on your decision making. And in this population, we chose the family unit as the primary social group that impacts thinking, and developed a gravity model to represent the stature of the family member and the frequency of contact as the primary ways of impacting the decision made by the individual. And then we combined all those things to develop a model that allowed us to forecast migration choices by different demographic groups. By age and gender were the primary ones we used, based on the information that was available to them And with that information, the government then could make choices about, well, what information do they want to promulgate and through what channels. This work got published and presented at a number of forums. You'll see Inforums, Moores, IEEE there, and also received a patent for the method of calculation and was transitioned into the Department of Homeland Security as part of the Secure Border Initiative that was going on at the time. The second project I'll talk about was geared at detecting disease outbreaks overseas. It was a hot topic in 2005 and 2006 after the bird flu pandemic. And we had a government sponsor that was really interested in being able to do early detections of those. At the time, the policy was for the US government to push resources out to locations where disease outbreaks were occurring rather than waiting until the disease appeared here in the US. So some of the challenges involved, although the medium we wanted to use was analysis of online press reports. In much of the world, the health infrastructure is not well developed, so it actually takes a good bit of time for someone with symptoms to present to a doctor who has access to a test and then reports the results of that test. We found we were able to make detections on the order of a week and a half faster than the WHO through our examination of press reports. We needed to be able to detect outbreaks even in places that had either a very weak public health system or in places where the host government was suppressing information. A lot of governments have very tight control over their information space and don't necessarily want people to know when things are going wrong. As our recent experience will show us, North Korea still has never reported a
Whoa. You still there, Charles? Okay. Seems like Charles having some connection issues.
I'll tell you something that's really interesting about this problem he's got on the screen right now is that it'd be interesting to redo it again with all the advances in natural language processing.
Yeah, it's true.
It's really interesting. Oh, yeah, he's dropping.
Okay, all right. He might be able to jump back in now. Okay, welcome back, Charles.
Am I back? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So let me reshare this slide. And it is my belief that I was talking about the challenges of
Right there.
disease detection.
Yes.
Okay. So in addition to the fact that many host governments are suppressing the information, we also had the challenge of trying to reduce analyst workload. The method they had been using was, okay, so they had already been collecting the online press reports from all across the world in many different languages. We ended up doing this automated in 18 different languages by the time we were done. But they had a center filled with analysts who were linguists and also had healthcare backgrounds, and they would actually try and read the articles as they came through. So we needed to reduce the workload on them. And then we needed to automate this inference of the likelihood of a local disease outbreak and not have it just be the judgment of an individual. So we worked through multiple approaches, but the one that worked best was we performed an analysis of the corpus of articles and identified keywords that were most closely associated with outbreaks in the past. And on the basis of the appearance of those keywords in combination on any given day in any given region, we would calculate a likelihood that there was an outbreak occurring. Oh, there you go. That's what some of the comparisons look like. So it's not that words never appeared when there was no outbreak. It's just they occurred a little more frequently during a period of an outbreak than they would otherwise. And the output that was presented to the analyst was essentially just a summarization of the articles retrieved for the day with a score indicating the likelihood of the calculated likelihood of an outbreak, the number of key terms that have been recognized, the headline of the article that had generated that score, and then a indication of the key phrases that were present and a link so that the analyst could then go read the article either in a machine translation or in the native language. And this just helps speed their work process and help focus their attention on a smaller set of articles so that they can make the determination of whether or not they thought there was an outbreak occurring. So a paper was published on this in the Journal of Information Processing and Management. But the real success here was this was transitioned into operation and was generating reports that made it to the presidential level. But real life creeps in. The total solution was very expensive between the watch center full of the linguists and the data center that collected all the articles, archived all the articles, and made all the inferences. It cost millions of dollars a year to run. So after 5 or so years of no pandemics occurring, some genius said, well, we need to cut this out of the budget, and it was shut down. And then in 2019, we all got to live out our favorite sci-fi fantasy of being locked down in a pandemic. But you can't win them all. Let's see. So the last project that I'll share with you was in response to, well, I started it in response to the financial crisis of 2008. And for those of us who were worrying about such things at the time, it really stood out how often different experts from different domains or different sources would make forecasts of what they thought was going to happen in the economy or what they thought was the cause for a given problem. And the conversation quickly devolved into finger pointing and who's right and who's wrong. And our thought was, well, what if we could create a way to present a composite view of what all the forecasts are, just as we do with spaghetti models in hurricane season, and also keep track of the provenance of the foundational data that people were making their calculations with and the assumptions that they were basing their decisions on. And if we had an environment where all those models could be displayed together, not only would we make it easier for decision makers to look across the models to try and support their decisions, but we would also make it easier for the modelers to not point fingers, but to have a discussion about, well, why am I getting a different result than you're getting? And what does that really mean? Because there are a lot of ways of representing data or the data that we choose that drive obvious reasons why you're getting different outputs. And that's a more constructive conversation to have than who's right and who's wrong. So we prototyped a financial modeling and analysis center, leveraging our resources and expertise on securely hosting and running models, because of course a lot of these models are highly proprietary or very sensitive. People don't want them getting out. We had some native abilities for data management so that you could keep track of for the 98th run of this model, we were using version 2.1 of the model software and have the provenance of the data that was input. So we could keep track of all the various factors that caused differing outputs. And then the ability to apply visualization tools to summarize and aggregate the outputs of those models. And our intention was to have financial regulators participate by providing non-public data to the center. University collaborators and industry collaborators could all bring alternative models, and then we would try and elevate the conversation a bit. This was published and presented quite a bit, but by 2010, we elected a new Congress that was much less concerned with financial crises and financial stability. And so we never got a chance to implement that with any. So that's what I wanted to share about those three projects. And I guess in summary, what I would share, or the thought that I would share, is that some of the key differences between conducting research in industry or academia that stand out to me is I probably have a lot less freedom about deciding what I want to research than someone in academia. I think that I probably on many occasions get more access to the people that are going to use the things that I'm trying to develop, and probably in some cases better access to data relevant to the specific domain. And I also would think I have more opportunity to actually transition products and get them into use, and sometimes even see them in use than many of the colleagues I know in academia. So there are companies that give you the opportunity to explore your interests, and that's some of my experience trying to do that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charles. Oh, any questions from the attendees? We're a little shy here. All right. Well, Mark is gonna lead us in. Okay, please, Mark.
I mentioned this to you when Charles went dark for a second there. So I just was wondering if you in the search for trying to figure out where we might be leading to the next pandemic, had you thought about redoing that effort with using natural language processing algorithms? It seems like now it would be done even without people.
Yes. So there was a lot of natural language processing going on because one of the things that that we did when we ingested the articles was ingest them, and we wanted to highlight and make them more easily read by analysts. So place names were called out. Let's see, what were place names, disease names, some of the things that we figured would be important to an analyst trying to skim through them. We did a couple of different things to do that, and of course, the ability to detect the keywords by our model depended on some natural language processing. This was 15 years ago, so some of the capabilities were not what they are today. We made the choice. I have my biases. I think it's a good choice to not allow a model to make the final determination of what we thought was happening, and to present that information to someone with expertise and responsibility and accountability to then go ahead and make that determination. And different users are going to have different appetites for that being a supportable, challengeable decision?
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, so those are just some of the factors. I'll also mention, as I said, we tried several different approaches to doing this. The first motivation for this came from a sociologist who the sponsor, the agency that sponsored this work was particularly interested in a specific region of the world, not just because they practice a lot of information suppression, but also because it's a region where a lot of very potent disease epidemics originate for whatever circumstance. So the motivation for taking this on was the expectation that the host government would suppress information, and the first motivating theory was that there would be indications of social disruption that could not be suppressed, that would be more detectable than the disease symptoms. So things like closing schools, canceling public events, closing public transportation, mobilizing military medical resources would be things that a country would have to do in the face of a bad epidemic that you could not conceal. So the earliest approaches were looking for signs of social disruption. But once we actually got into the press reports in detail, we saw that we didn't actually need to do that, because what often happens, and again, we went to very local news sources. So, for example, not the Washington Post, but the Fairfax County Times, right? Very often what would happen is there would be a newspaper article printed that a little girl showed up at the hospital with strange symptoms, you know. So before anyone could get activated to suppress the information, you would get little peeks at what was going on if you were looking closely enough. Also, and this kind of ties back to the use of natural language processing, context and meaning becomes very important. There are different cultures and different things happen. So, for example, a fever is an important symptom in many of the diseases we're interested in. And in many parts of the world, fever was a very useful keyword for us. But in South America, they have very frequent outbreaks of football fever, right? It's just a term they use all the time. So you just couldn't use it there because there's always fever, right? That's just one example, but some judgment was needed, and that detail to get that early detection was important. I'm sorry, it looks like there's another question.
Yeah, before we get to Mark's question, I want to be conscious of time. It's noon. Thank you everyone for attending the session. I'm happy to keep the call open for a couple of minutes so we can hang out. There's no problem. We would love to hear your thoughts and comments about this seminar. If you have any comments, any suggestions, either for this type of event or any future events, please follow the link in the chat. I'm going to post it one more time, and let us know what you think. So again, thank you everyone, and thank again to our speakers for being kind enough to be here with us.
Thanks for inviting us. I do want to ask another question. The reason I'm going to ask it is I know you're recording, and maybe this will get on, and someone will, if they can't attend today, maybe they'll want to hear Charles's answer to my question. I'm very familiar with MITRE, and I think of it as closer closer to academia than, say, oh, I don't know, so we're going to Amazon and say Amazon, because there's a bottom line that needs to be, cost is one of the bigger pieces of what we think about as Amazon versus MITRE being a nonprofit. So my question is, do you feel that the general industry interactions between academia are getting closer together than they were, let's say, 20 years ago? Or is it continued to be, I feel like there's always been a sort of a bifurcation between those two areas? My question is, do you feel there's some coming together of this, or do you feel it's still a distance between the two? That's sort of my question.
No, that's an interesting question. I think that there are a couple of things going on. First, I'll mention that uh, even as a nonprofit, there is a very important bottom line. Nothing that we do makes a profit, but we can't lose money, right? And so there are financial pressures that are non-obvious, and constraints, and we are always accountable to our clients and government, asking, well, what have you done with all this money you spent, right? And so there's a lot of pressure to have good answers for that. So we spend a lot more time worrying about what things cost than you might have thought. We by culture and by our mission, have always been very open to a lot of collaboration with academia. I think that other companies may have been changing that openness, but I think that varies a lot by industry and by discipline. So if you build things out of steel, right, there's probably some small set of schools that are dominant in your industry and that are well known for their specialization in the disciplines that support what you do. So then it might not be quite as easy for some other school to say, hey, I got a great idea, let's collaborate. But what we have seen, so I'm in information technology, systems engineering, OR type of person, right? So one of the things we've experienced over the last 30 years, and more acutely last 20, 15 years, is the power and utility of information has increased very dramatically, and the appreciation of that importance has increased very dramatically. So I think there are more companies feeling compelled to do collaborations that get them access to the latest, greatest, newest thinking in areas that they did not used to feel that.
Yeah,
I
and completely agree with this.
Okay. And one more thing that's changed is, and I'll speak of telecommunications as a use case. 40 years ago, the most exciting, most advanced work in telecommunications were happening with the government, because they have a lot of very unique needs and a huge investment in satellite and high speed and packet and switch and all manner of things to get information from one place to another place. And that's where it was happening. But that's been turned on its head. Now the latest and greatest advances in telecommunications are coming out of industry, and a small segment of highly innovative, fast-moving companies are generating disproportionately a lot of stuff. So a lot of companies have been forced to invert their model from, I'm going to have a super secret laboratory where I do great stuff, to I got to find out what everyone else is doing and try and get some of their stuff into my organization. And that has, I think, inverted that relationship a lot as well.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. All right, I could talk to you forever, but maybe we should probably go back to work, I guess.
All right, excellent. Thank you all for attending. Have a good rest of the day.